Yeah, and it's also a method for me. It's my personal language learning method, because as I re-listen to it, then I can memorize small snippets and I try to implement it into my speech.
On this week's podcast, Daniel Goodson from My Fluent podcast joins me to talk about disfluencies. What are they? Why do we make them? Should we worry about disfluencies? And if we want to reduce them, how can we? Also, how has podcasting helped Daniel become such a wonderfully fluent English speaker? And can podcasting help you too? Welcome to Aprender Inglés with Daniel and Craig. Daniel, it's fantastic to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time today to speak to me and share your knowledge with my audience. How are you?
I am pumped, actually. I'm really pumped. Thank you very much for reaching out to me to make this swapcast. It's really connected with me, this topic, actually, as we will learn later, because I started out with my Fluent podcast because of disfluencies, because of my disfluencies.
Well, we'll talk about disfluencies in a few minutes, but that's the first thing I wanted to ask you, Daniel. How would you describe your podcast, which is called My Fluent Podcast, to someone who's never heard it?
Craig, actually, maybe it's strange what I am telling you now, because in my opinion, even I can't put my finger what My Fluent Podcast exactly is, because as my speech is transforming always, so is My Fluent Podcast. And it has been quite a journey for me. I started out back in 2016, where I couldn't speak freely. So the episodes were all scripted. And the idea was to share my thoughts on my language learning methods. So it was like how to do something. And then later, it became like an interview-based show in which I invited language lovers, so to say. And yeah, I can't put my finger on it, what it is, but what I can tell you is that it's about the love of learning languages. And sometimes people, they think that it's about learning English specifically, but that's actually not true. So the goal is to inspire people to learn languages and also to get to know maybe people who are podcasters, who are learners, who are teachers. I try to show the human being behind them. Maybe it's not always that obvious, because of course I try to show specific methods. For example, I will give you an example. There was a guy called Vince from the Philippines, and he told me that he would listen to podcasts at the 3 times speed.
Wow.
It's incredible. And then my goal was to research if this could be like a method to improve in our target language. That was like the theme of the episode.
That's incredible. I often tell my students to slow down the podcast to 0.5 speed, not to speed it up to more, because their problem is often listening. But apart from your motivation in the podcast for language learning, languages in general, I also notice an underlying love and motivation of podcasts. So were you a podcast listener before you started My Fluent Podcast as a way to improve your listening skills?
Yes, I was an avid podcast listener. Actually, when I was listening to podcasts in the beginning, nobody else knew what a podcast is, right? So my friends, my relatives, and I was really motivated. This was really a love for me. And yeah, I wanted to make my own podcast, but then I thought I can't do it in German. this is maybe also strange because I have a strange relationship with my own dialect because I am speaking Swiss German, and even in Switzerland, my dialect is supposed to be very exotic. So in a way, I was ashamed to to podcast in standard German because everyone would know, right? Because if I am just saying one single word, everyone knows where I come from. I don't know if you can relate with me a little bit, but
I'm trying to think of a parallel. Maybe it would be me podcasting for an American or Canadian or Australian audience as an Australian or an American, and they know that my accent, even though I speak the same language, is from a different place. Something like that?
Yeah. Or maybe, someone from Scotland who has maybe a very thick accent, and then people would listen to it and they wouldn't understand, right? So
yeah.
And then I decided to make it in English, but the problem was I was not able to speak in English, and also that was a reason to start out so that I can become a fluent speaker, right? Because I was not able to speak freely. This maybe comes also because I am an introvert. I am not an outgoing person. And even in my mother tongue, I am rather a person who likes to be maybe listening to others, right? And I'm not a person who shares his opinion to everyone, right?
But you realize that's an oxymoron for a podcaster. Somebody who's very shy, who doesn't like to put themselves out there and be in the public eye or the public ear, starts a podcast. But I want to say, I think it's a fantastic way for anybody to practice their English. And I commend you on the job you've done. If you have any advice for my listeners listening to this, or your listeners who want to do this as well, how would you advise them to begin podcasting to improve their English or any language?
Yeah. First off, I would say that the most important thing is just to start out, right? Because podcasting is not difficult anymore, and there are possibilities in which you can podcast for free. You don't even have to spend money on it. You can begin slowly. You could even start recording on your mobile phone, and then you don't even need to publish it. You could do 10 episodes and then see what happens. It's all about being creative. And this is a great tool to use your target language to practice. And maybe something will sparkle, a fire in you, and then you will love it, and then the journey will continue.
And you will end up speaking as fluently as Daniel. So I highly recommend you jump on the train and do that journey as Daniel did. So you have My Fluent podcast, which you started in 2016. So it's a long-running, very popular podcast in which you interview other language learners. And you have another podcast called The Vocab Man. Tell us about that.
Exactly. So whenever I come across a great expression that I want to learn, then I want to teach it at the same time. So that means this could be even from an interview. This could be from this interview here. Maybe I spot a great example, and then I make a podcast episode out of it, in which I explain the audience what it is, where it came from, and I would also integrate some examples. This could also be examples from the internet, but it's all about getting used to an expression, and ideally it would be a practical expression which you can use in your daily life. But it's not always the case, because sometimes I come across really bizarre words in which I think I must cover it for the Vocab Man.
Like the heebie-jeebies, for example, or yuck.
Exactly, yeah.
Or one you even used at the beginning of this conversation. You said, I can't put my finger on it. And that was an expression, I think, that appeared recently as well.
Yes, that was the last one. And I also try to integrate it into my interviews or whenever I speak, because that's the way it works the best. When you use the expressions then you can remember them better. Yeah.
That's a wonderful idea. Funnily enough, I was speaking to a student of mine yesterday who has just finished a conversation course with me, but she wants to expand her vocabulary more. And I think that's a perfect way to do it. If you go and listen to The Vocabulary Man, which is Daniel's podcast, then you can really learn some of the more common but unusual expressions and vocabulary and collocations that you don't normally find in a course book if you're studying a formal English course.
Exactly. So, and maybe it's time that I ask you about your podcast. I mean, you are already more than 10 years in, right? How many years are you podcasting?
Well, it depends how you measure it. If you want to talk about the podcast as it more or less is now, which I'm quite happy with and I think it works, then I think we have to go back to 2014. So that's 8 years, is it? But I started before that. I started creating audio for the website, mansioningles.com. And then I started doing a solo podcast, just me, which wasn't very good. So I don't really count that because it was boring. And I was basically reading a list of exercises, vocabulary and grammar exercises that was putting me to sleep. So don't go and listen to that. It wasn't very good. But when I started with my co-host Reza, then from 2014.
Yeah, and I came across an interview with you and Reza. And Reza asked you a bunch of questions. And I wanted to show you one audio snippet. So let's check it out right now.
Craig, what do you see yourself doing in 10 years' time?
I'd like to be doing the same sort of things I'm doing now, pretty much. Teaching, working in education, having a presence and hopefully an influence on the internet, helping people learn English.
What do you think, Greg? So almost 8 years passed, and now did the prediction come true?
More or less. I'm not working in the same place. I used to work for a language academy called the British Council, but I was made redundant last year. So now I focus 100% online learning with conversation courses mostly, but also exam courses. So I'm doing the same kind of teaching, but I'm doing it over the internet, only over the internet. And yeah, I mean, I'm proud of the podcast. So I guess that's one thing that I'm happy with. I think some of the content I've created for YouTube and Facebook in particular, it could be better. So that's something I'm working on. But generally speaking, I'm happy with the way things are going. I do feel I'm helping people. And that's one of the joys of teaching. And I think English teachers listening to this hopefully will agree that you're never going to be super rich, but you do get a lot of job satisfaction at the end of the day because you're helping people get promoted, get jobs, pass interviews, pass exams, and get on in life and communicate. So I think that's a good thing.
And I mean, you receive a lot of feedback, and also your listener, they send in audio records all the time. It's incredible.
Yeah, the audio recordings, they put petrol in my tank, so to speak. They really keep me going and keep my co-host Reza going as well. When we hear from listeners who have achieved something because they got a higher level of English, whether that be, as I said, promotion or a new job, then that really makes us happy. And we're lucky to have a very communicative and interactive community.
And maybe one question about your podcast. So English podcast has different types of episodes. So could you tell us the different variations of it?
Well, it was born as a co-hosted podcast with myself and Reza, and that's been the majority of the episodes. The bulk of most of the episodes, Reza and I will speak about or teach or introduce and practice grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and different aspects of English. Most of those ideas come from our community. So people who send in feedback and questions, we answer them on the podcast. And occasionally, like here today, I'll bring people on and introduce them to our audience because I think it could benefit them. And I've been mixing in more of these interviews recently. We're trying to bring in some more people and mix it up a bit and introduce people to our audience.
And how do you think can the listeners get the best out of these interviews when they are listening to them?
Well, people learn in different ways, and some people are very methodical. So if they find our podcast, and we've got over 400 episodes now, I think 430, and if they realize they like it, they'll go back to number one. So they'll start at number one, and then they'll work through one by one. They'll work through the episodes. And some people like to dip in, and they'll search for a particular grammar point or vocabulary area, and they'll just choose the podcast by the title, by the episode title, which is fine too. So the episodes are not in seasons or chapters. They're just one after the other. It's a weekly podcast. And if you want to study something specific, you can go to inglespodcast.com and use the search to find a specific topic.
If I got you correct, so your podcast is kind of evergreen because you can use them even if the episodes are old, right? Because they are always with value.
I hope so.
It doesn't matter when you are consuming them.
I hope so. Look, if it's about the first conditional or the third conditional or a grammar point, then yeah, I suppose they are evergreen. They'll always have value. We try to keep away from news and current affairs, but we were asked time and time again, many times, to do a podcast about Brexit. So eventually we said, okay, and we discussed Brexit. Now that probably isn't so relevant now, but if anybody's interested to hear our opinion, they can go and listen to our episode on Brexit. But generally speaking, we keep away from news for this reason, so that it's evergreen and it always has value.
So what do you think? Let's dive into today's topic.
Okay, disfluencies. So I'm pleased that you agreed to speak about this with me, Daniel, because it's an area of interest that's very current for me. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about disfluencies and introducing disfluency as a focus for my students to try and improve their fluency. Let's start with a definition. What are disfluencies, or what do you understand by disfluencies?
So first off, let me just quickly say something before I dive into it, because first I have to say that the word in itself, disfluencies, is terrible. I think it's terrible because it has such negative connotations, right? It sounds so negative. In my view, as I have a podcast called My Fluent Podcast, so my aim is to become fluent. And when I am hearing disfluencies, it shudders.
That's interesting. That's so interesting, because I never thought about that. I thought, because I've read a bit about this, and I thought it's a pretty good term to describe what, if you think of the prefix dis, which is the negative prefix. So disinformation, for example, is not information, and fluency, disfluency, is very descriptive. But can you think of a better term? Because many people say crutch words is a disfluency, really. So if I say to you crutch words, do you know what I mean?
Yes, I know what you mean then. I think it's the most common, the most well-known term, I guess. So for me, disfluencies are like obstacles that make you hinder being fluent. So maybe we could talk about the different parts of it. You mentioned the crutch words.
Yeah, crutch words is just one. I mean, the technical definition of a disfluency is any interruption in the normal flow of speech. That's the technical definition. And I think we should make it very clear from the beginning, and I'll probably repeat this 10 or 20 times. Native speakers have disfluencies too. Native speakers use these. It's not something that's especially prominent or assigned to language learners. So a crutch word, if people don't know what a crutch is, if you injure your leg or you break your leg or sprain your ankle or have a problem with your leg, maybe you get this stick from the hospital to help you walk, and that's a crutch. So a crutch word when you're speaking English is a word or a noise that you use to help you speak or to give your speech seemingly more fluency, although I'm not convinced that that's actually true. So that's a crutch word. Do you know any examples of crutch words?
For example, you know is the classic, I think. And also this, I don't know if it's a word, it's the ums, right? I guess depending on your language, it differs maybe.
Yes, it's slightly different. For example, I teach a lot of Spanish students. They live in Spain, so it's slightly different. It's more like which is a higher pitch and a slightly different sound, but it has the same function. But you're right, it's words, anything that fills the silence or gives you time to think before you continue speaking. Another one that's really common, especially in American English, is like. So I said like to him, like he was going like to the shops, and then like he said like, and it's something that goes inside the sentence and affects the fluency.
I noticed that in my interviews, I say a lot right in the end of my questions, right. I also say a lot like, and it bothers me. It bothers me not during the interview, but when I am editing the interview, and then I notice them, and it bothers me.
Do you remove it when you're editing?
I remove some of them because I think it's not fair to remove everything, because that would be cheating, right? Because everyone would think that I am 100% fluent, and that's just not right.
I agree. My crutch word is so. I tend to begin far too many sentences with so, and it's just not necessary. It's a word that really annoys me, really bothers me. And like you, I remove some of them because it annoys me so much, but also I leave some in because it also serves as a way to change the topic of conversation. You want to change what you're talking about and move on to another topic, and you use the linking word so. But there are other ways that you can be a bit disfluent in your speech. You can repeat words. I think you should practice like that. You can elongate the vowel sound. And I had a student recently that did this, and I had to draw her attention to it because she was saying, I think you... So that elongation of the vowel was giving her time to think of the next word, which is okay. I mean, all of these are fine. It's just when you do them too often, the listener becomes aware, and then they can only hear that, and they stop hearing the other words.
Absolutely. And one thing that I have noticed is that in the interviews for my podcast, sometimes I wouldn't notice the crutch words or the disfluencies of my interviewee. And because it doesn't bother me, right? Because the conversation goes on and I can understand everything. The other person can understand me. But then when I am editing again, all of a sudden, like 200 crutch words pop up, right? And it's incredible because my brain didn't see it during the conversation. It's just afterwards.
And you noticed when you were editing. That's interesting.
Yes.
I think it's also maybe that's an interesting. Is it more obvious when you listen to a podcast when you're not an active part of the conversation? It's more noticeable, perhaps.
I think so.
I never thought of that.
Because also if the conversation is complex, maybe you are too focused on the important part, right? And another person would be more laid back, maybe. They don't have to think about a lot of stuff at the same time, and then they can notice it.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I had a Spanish neighbor who I got on really well with because we had the same taste in music. And when I spoke to him, especially about music, we had these long conversations, and his crutch word was sabes. And sabes translates to, you know. So he'd say, me gusta este, like I really like this person, sabes. And I went out to buy the CD, sabes. And all I could hear in the conversation was sabes, because every sentence had 10 you knows inside it. And it distracted me from the conversation. So it can be a problem, especially for language learners, because language learners, more than native speakers, sometimes they're translating in their head from their mother tongue and they need that extra time, so they use a disfluency. Or maybe their brain is trying to catch up, or there's something going on. They're searching for vocabulary in their head and they're making these noises and they don't realize they're doing it. So my reason for bringing this to people's attention is not to stop them completely, is to make the students aware that they're doing it, because very often they don't know, and just to try to reduce a bit the number of disfluencies they use, which will make them more fluent.
Yeah, now comes a situation into my mind where you were the best man or the co-best man in a wedding, and you had to prepare this wedding speech. And I think you mentioned it in the podcast episode with Martin Johnston, and then you didn't notice it while practicing. And then the other person, he told you that you had such a lot of crutch words used. And then...
Yes, exactly. You need to be told. It's a bit like you're walking around with a piece of lettuce in your tooth or a piece of tomato, and somebody has say, hey, you have something in your tooth. Oh, thank you very much. It's that kind of thing where if nobody tells you, I didn't know I was saying so many ers, ers. And yeah, when I realized, then I tried to reduce them a bit. So shall we speak a little about how people can reduce these disfluencies if they are noticing that they're using crutch words or
Yes.
So one thing I suggest is just slow down. And I spoke about this on that podcast that you mentioned, Daniel, with Martin, just to slow down your speech. Don't rush. Maybe you feel a bit nervous when you're speaking a second language, but even so, try to slow down as much as possible. And it's okay to leave pauses. If you pause instead of then it creates an effect that's almost magical, because the listener will lean in to the conversation and be more attentive, waiting for you to say the next thing. So pauses are your friend. Don't be afraid of silence when you're speaking.
Yeah, or instead of silences, you could also use expressions like, I've lost my train of thought. So there are many similar expressions which buy you time. When you are familiar with them, you can use them and it gives you time, like 1 second or so. So instead of saying, you could even say, Greg, what a fantastic question you asked me, or something like that. Then this gives you also 1 second time instead of saying,
Exactly. And if you listen to native speakers, they tend to have their own strategies and techniques for that kind of thing. One friend I have who's also a podcaster uses the word interesting a lot. So if somebody says something, to give him time to collect his thoughts, he'll say, interesting. Yes, let me think. Those kind of space fillers to give you time before you answer are very useful.
And maybe you could work on your pronunciation, because sometimes when I don't know how exactly the pronunciation is of a word, then I overthink stuff, and that makes me slower then. And yeah, it's like I'm getting stuck, right? So whenever you come across a word that you are not familiar with, you can practice it. You can learn the pronunciation, and the next time you will be more fluent.
How do you think people can use technology to improve their fluency?
So, for example, they can record themselves. This could be with their own mobile phone, and then they can re-listen to it, and they will notice the crutch words and the disfluencies, and then they can re-record it, right? So maybe you have a topic, and then you practice it, and I'm sure if you talk about something 5 times, the 5th time it will be better than the first time. So maybe some specific apps. This could be YouTube. Well, it's not an app, but if you upload a video of yourself and you don't need to publish it, you can just upload it and have it private. And then you can make the subtitles. YouTube will do it for you. And then you will see all the ums. And this gives you an indication if you are using too many crutch words, for example.
Can I just make a comment based on
Yes,
that
sure.
idea? Because Descript, I think, is an app that as a podcaster. Descript is, well, how would you describe it? It's a podcast editing software suite that also has voice to text. So Descript will transcribe your words into text, and you can see, as you just said with YouTube, exactly what you've just said. But you probably know this, Daniel, this Descript software also has a function that can remove your ums and your ers and your ahs, disfluencies. And I've listened to podcasts that apply this feature, and it sounds terrible. Because it doesn't sound so fluent. It sounds false. It sounds robotic. So again, I'm going to say it, don't over-obsess about these disfluencies because they do occur with native speakers. I just wanted to make that clear so that people don't think they have to be absolutely perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe at this point, I could show a little audio snip of Keanu Reeves because he's using a lot of crutch words.
Good idea.
Well, first of all, I would like to ask you, because you're such a famous actor, how do you do to manage the ego?
Oh, for me, I just, I know I'm a pretty simple guy. Ever since I was a young kid, I wanted to act. I started professional acting when I was 15. And I've been really lucky to have the chance to have a career. And I don't know, I just have always tried to keep it simple.
So what do you think, Greg? Is it okay to use that many crutch words as an actor?
Is it okay? First of all, let me say I'm a huge Keanu Reeves fan. So I don't want to criticize him too much. But in my opinion, I think 8 or 9 in 45 seconds for somebody whose speech is part of their profession, I think is too many. Maybe it's him because he is a cool guy. Maybe he's doing it on purpose to give that laid back, relaxed vibe and impression. Maybe if the interviewee was somebody like Anthony Hopkins, he wouldn't get so many and disfluencies. Imagine that Keanu Reeves is a lawyer or a pilot or somebody who needs to inspire confidence and integrity. If they're saying, well, I don't know, and they're sounding so unsure of themselves, it affects the way they project themselves to the public. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there is a little problem when we are consuming, let's say, movies or series. You don't see crutch words. So maybe this is misleading a little bit because we think that it's not normal. And it is normal, as we could see in one example, but there are many more examples.
So do you think he's doing it on purpose, or you think that's the way he normally speaks?
I think it's just Keanu Reeves, how he is.
Maybe. I'm not sure.
Okay, where were we? We were on the apps, right?
Yes. We spoke about YouTube. We spoke about the script. You made the wonderful suggestion of using mobile phones that everybody has in their pocket to record and record again and record again, and be critical when you listen back to your recordings and ask yourself the question, how can I improve this? Have I mispronounced some vowel sounds or a word? Can I improve am I making too many ums? Am I too hesitant in my speech? And another suggestion is to use apps like Siri and Google Assistant, or Alexa, the lady in the tube who can listen to your English, obviously change it to English if English isn't automatically programmed in these devices. And if the device has a problem understanding you, then maybe you have to tweak or change a little the way you're pronouncing words. And of course, if you're using too many disfluencies and crutch words, it also may have a problem understanding your commands.
There is another app called Otter. I'm sure you are familiar with it.
I use it, yeah.
And it's free, I think, or at least a certain amount of time is for free. So you could use it and also store your conversations with the transcript.
Yeah, it's very good speech to text. It's one of the most accurate speech to text software programs I've used to transcribe the podcast. It's very, very good.
Another point would be your state of mind, right? Because if you are stressed out, this might have an effect on your speech. So if someone, is really overwhelmed by, I don't know, by life, if a lot is going on at the same time, maybe you should take a break, because it will show. It will show if you're not sleeping 2 days. It will have a massive effect on your speech, and I am sure that you will use more crutch words.
Yes. Also in presentations. Have you ever had to give a presentation in front of people, an audience?
Yes, I have, indeed.
It makes me very anxious and very nervous. And the result is I tend to speak quicker, faster, and obviously with more disfluencies.
Yeah, another example that I can give you is when I had an interview with Luke Thompson, because he's sort of an idol of me, because I think he is one of the best podcasters out there. And when I had the interview back in 2017, I was trembling, right? And I was stuttering, and this happens also right now in this interview, because it is very important to me, and it makes me becoming less fluent, but it's okay.
I did listen to that interview with Luke, and I thought you did a wonderful job.
I would like to ask you, you have been a podcaster for 10 years and more, depending on the definition, but did you become a better speaker over the time, or a better communicator? Because, I mean, you are also a teacher, and for you, this is quite normal to be in front of people and speaking, right?
I wouldn't say it's normal. I've never felt comfortable doing it, but I like, and you've said this many times on your podcast, going outside your comfort zone and doing something that you don't feel particularly comfortable doing is sometimes a wonderful way to improve at anything.
Yes.
So just jumping and into the water and just trying things is really good. So I think the few times I've done public speaking at conferences, etc., has been because I wanted to push myself. I never really enjoyed it, but I felt great after. It's a bit like going to the gym. You don't want to go, but you never feel bad after. So I'd recommend that people do it. But the question was about the podcast. I don't think by itself it helped me to become a more fluent, a better speaker, but it did make me more aware of how I speak. And as an interviewer yourself, and I know that interviews can be really difficult at times, I think you might agree that interviewing people is a skill that's, first of all, a challenge. It's very difficult, but when you have a successful interview, you feel so good that you've had a good conversation, and it's not only benefiting you, but it's benefiting the people who are listening. It's a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. And I must repeat myself because, as I said, I am an introvert. And for me, it is even difficult in my mother tongue to reach out to a stranger, right, in real life, because I'm really shy. So for me, it was really, really hard to reach out to others, even if it's online. And I was literally trembling and very, very nervous. But I love it, right? Because I can have a connection with people that I would never have met them otherwise. So for me, podcasting is really beautiful. It's more than just 40 minutes recording, publish, and that's it. For me, it's getting in touch with other people. And I kept in touch with many interviewees over the years. And it's just beautiful to share our views and to have something in common. Yeah, it's really beautiful. But I think you can only know how it is when you podcast yourself. Maybe, I don't know.
No, I agree with that. I think that's a fantastic place to finish. So you've heard it from Daniel, a person who doesn't feel particularly comfortable speaking with other people and especially putting himself out there on a podcast. But listen to his English. Look how far he's come and how much fun and benefits he's getting from podcasting. So go and start one. Go out and start a podcast today in English. Follow in Daniel's footsteps, and I don't think you'll regret it. Any final words, Daniel?
No, I just wanted to say that, yeah, anyone grab a microphone and push the record button. And if you have any questions, I can, of course, help you to set up your own podcast.
Many, many thanks to Daniel for agreeing to do this podcast crossover. And now it really is your turn to practice your English. Why not take Daniel's advice and record your voice? You can start slowly, start gradually. If you've never sent us a voice message before, now you can record your voice. Tell us your name, where you're from, and let us know what you think about this podcast and what your opinion is on the things that Daniel and I talked about. How do you do it? Well, go to the website inglespodcast.com and send us a voice message using the SpeakPipe service, or just go to speakpipe.com. That's speakpipe.com/inglespodcast. If you prefer to write, you can send me an email to Craig, Craig, at inglespodcast.com, or belfastreza@gmail.com if you want to reach out to Reza. All of the links and information that Daniel and I spoke about in this podcast, you can find those on the show notes at inglespodcast.com/437. And if you would like to purchase a paid course to help you with your English, why not visit the Mansion Inglés online store? You will find that at store.mansioningles.com. fluency.net. And before I say goodbye this week, I want to thank all of you who continue to help us by supporting this podcast on Patreon. And you too can be a Patreon supporter for as little as $1.20 per month. And that 20 cents includes the VAT tax. When you sign up to Patreon, you get instant access to recent transcriptions of our podcasts, which means you can read all of the words that we say in the audio. Go to patreon.com, patreon.com/Ingles podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends. Don't forget to visit Daniel's website, My Fluent Podcast. And until next time, thank you so much for listening. The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.